Brest, or Briest, is a city that today is located in the west of Belarus, on the border with Poland. But in 1918, when Poland was created, it was located in the middle of Polish territory. In August 1939, Minister Ribbentrop traveled to Moscow to sign the non-aggression pact with the Soviets, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Germans and the Soviets signed a secret protocol, and in that secret protocol, the division of Poland went along the Bug River. And right on the border with the city of Brest, at the confluence of the Bug River with the Mukovets River, in 1836, the Russian Empire built the Brest Fortress to strengthen its western borders, shortly after the Napoleonic period. Let's discuss the fortress structure. It had 4 distinct fortifications. Bring up the map. In the center was the Citadel, between the confluence of the branches of the Mukovets River and the Bug River. There were also 3 outer fortifications: Terespol, which protected the west bank; Volin, which protected the southern sector; and Kobrin, which protected the northern and eastern sectors, that is, the northeast. The outer fortifications of Brest were about 10 meters high, and the walls, made of red bricks, were up to 2 meters thick. The many bastions and ravelins of the walls were covered by moats and detached outworks. Didn't you understand? I'll explain it to you later. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, Brest was in Polish hands and was taken on September 17th, the same day the Soviets invaded Poland from the east, in the famous Battle of Brest-Litovsk. The Germans took the fortress, but quickly handed it over to Soviet control, because, according to the already mentioned secret protocol, that part of Polish territory was to be given to the Soviet Union. So for almost 2 years, after the 20-year hiatus during which the fortress was in Polish hands, the Soviets reinforced and multiplied the defensive systems. By the summer of 1941, it already had a fairly large contingent and a significant number of defensive weapons. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the famous Operation Barbarossa. It is not our goal today to discuss the reasons Germany had for invading the Soviet Union, nor the operational details of Barbarossa, but suffice it to say that it was the largest invasion operation in history, and that the Brest Fortress was located in the middle of that gigantic front from north to south. At the center of the German formation was Army Group Center, commanded by Marshal Fedor von Bock, whose objectives included capturing Panzer Holben, the railway running directly from Brest to Moscow. Also, the bridges over the Bug River were vital for moving troops into Soviet territory. In this way, in the very first hours of combat, the Brest Fortress became the first site of confrontation between the German army and the Soviet army. The Soviet garrison of the fortress was made up of about 9,000 soldiers. Most of these soldiers, as you might guess, came from the 6th and 42nd Rifle Divisions, the Russian equivalent of an infantry division. There was also the 17th People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs Border Guards Detachment, and some other small units, as well as 300 family members of officers who were stationed inside the fortress. On the attacking side, there was the 45th Infantry Division commanded by General Fritz Schliefer. This division was of Austrian origin and recruited from the outskirts of Linz, so you can see that it was one of Hitler's favorites. The 45th Infantry Division was supported by the artillery of the 31st and 34th Infantry Divisions. On the first day of combat, they were lent a battery of Stugs. But the most unique and curious unit to support General Schliefer was, for sure, the Schwerin Artillery Abteilung 833, or the 833 RD Heavy Artillery Battalion, which was equipped with the gigantic and monstrous 600mm Karl Gerät mortars. At 4:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht opened an artillery barrage on the Brest Fortress, even using Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. They completely surprised the fortress garrison. The barrage lasted about 30 minutes. And shortly after that, the first German combat groups began to cross the Bug River in small boats toward the eastern bank, amid the German artillery barrage. The two gigantic and monstrous 600mm mortars, nicknamed Odin and Thor, fired a total of 31 2-ton shells together. These shells, which contained concrete penetrating explosives, caused massive damage to the fortress. And among the dead and wounded in this first barrage, the fortress garrison lost more than 50% of its strength, roughly 5,000 people. Precisely because of this, the Soviets were never able to form a cohesive defense of the fortress, only defending specific points scattered throughout the area. Chaos reigned completely on the morning of the 22nd, with the deaths of many officers. So with the exception of Major Pyotr Gabrilov, who commanded the 44th Rifle Regiment, all the other leaders of resistance points were self-proclaimed. In other words, anyone who could give a sensible order and convince others to follow it could become a leader and would end up taking charge of the resistance. This was the case with political commissar Yefim Fomin, who ended up leading the resistance at the Kron Gate, which is on the southern side of the Citadel. Put up the small map so you can see, as I said, the Brest fortress had 4 fortifications. Since fighting was intense in each, we should analyze the German invasion of the fortress in 4 stages. Let's start with the Terespol fortification, which was on the west bank of the fortress and was defended by the 17th People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs Border Guard Detachment. And it didn't total more than 300 men. And these 300 men had to face the 135th Regiment of the 45th Division, since the defense was divided and scattered. The southern part of the fortification was defended by Lieutenant Arkhim Stepanovich Cherney's forces. Meanwhile, the defense of the northern part was under the command of Lieutenant Fyodor Mikhailovich Melnikov. But besides these two, some groups of Russian soldiers ended up defending the wall that faces west. So, about 80 Russian soldiers defended spaced points along that wall against the Germans. On the first day, when the Germans really tried to invade Terespol, the guards suffered very heavy casualties. But the guys were really tough and held their ground. They counterattacked with bayonets, forcing the Germans to retreat. By the 24th, Cherney and Melnikov's forces, which now numbered only 40 men, retreated into the Citadel. But with the Germans inside, they couldn't hold their position and ended up moving to the northern fortification, Kobrin. The next day, Melnikov was killed in combat and Cherney was captured. Between the 25th and 30th, only a small group of Russian soldiers, led by Lieutenant Zhdanov, continued defending Terespol. On the night of the 30th, they tried to swim across the Bug River toward the Citadel, but the Germans spotted them. Of the 45 who tried to cross, only 18 made it. Stop. Are you enjoying the video? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I'll be checking. Next, let's discuss the Volin fortification at the fortress's southern end. We'll see that this sector had 2 hospitals and a school. From the 84th Rifle Regiment, these people faced General Schlitter's 133rd Infantry Regiment. There were many wounded in those hospitals. The head of the district hospital, Boris Alexeyevich Maslow, as well as his deputy, Nikolai Semyonovich Bogativ, organized the evacuation of all these wounded to the Citadel. On that same day, Bogativ was mortally wounded in hand-to-hand combat against the German invaders. However, despite setting foot in Volin on the first day, the Germans had to face stubborn resistance from the students of the Ivos 84th Regiment School. And they had to commit their reserves in this first attack, failing by the end of the day. On the 23rd, the action in Volin began with another German artillery barrage on the fortification, which was followed by a second attack. The second attack was repelled, causing heavy casualties. However, on the 24th, the 2nd Battalion of the 133rd Regiment ended up taking the Volin fortification. The remaining defenders of Volin ended up retreating into the Citadel. Now come with me up north to the Kobrin fortification, which was the largest of the Brest fortress fortifications. There were an infantry regiment, an anti-aircraft battalion, and a tank battalion stationed there. in addition to the houses scattered across the area for the 170 families of officers who worked at the fortress. Early in the morning of June 22nd, the 135th Regiment burst through the northwest gate and tried to cut off the Russians, who were escaping to the eastern fortification. In the meantime, several officers were caught at home and couldn't join their troops. This caused the resistance inside Kobrin to once again become scattered and without clear leadership. The Germans also attacked the eastern sector, but there the attack was stopped by the 98th Tank Battalion. Some units of the Tank Battalion managed to evade the fortress and go to rendezvous points outside the location, closer to the city. But most of them ended up staying together, and this remainder was reorganized into a battle group by Lieutenant Ivan Filipovich Akimoshkin and Commissar Nikolai Vasilievich Nesterchuk. At the north gate of the Kobrin fortification, the Germans were forced to retreat by the most stubborn Soviet resistance in the Brest fortress, which was commanded by Major Pyotr Mikhailovich Gavrilov. The next day, the Germans attacked the north gate again and eventually broke through Soviet resistance. Thus, all resistance in the Kobrin sector became concentrated in the eastern sector, commanded by Major Gavrilov. At this point, it's worth pausing to note that the Germans' original plan stated that Brest had to be captured on the first day of combat. But the resistance of the Russians, combined with the fact that much of the fortress had turned into rubble, ended up making the Soviet defense easier. The fighting went on for more than a week, until the 29th, when the High Command finally authorized an air bombardment by the Luftwaffe over the eastern sector, which finally made the Soviets surrender in that sector. However, a small group of Soviet resistors remained active in the underground of Kobrin until July 23rd. All this delay made General Schliefer have to write extensive and detailed reports about his actions there in Brest. These reports describe in great detail everything that happened, all the setbacks and successes the Germans had in taking the fortress. Our analysis of this intense battle wouldn't be complete without examining events inside the Citadel. Though it was the smallest of the fortress's 4 areas, the Citadel held the most military units, and it also had the largest number of cannons, some T-38 amphibious tanks, and even BA-10 reconnaissance armored vehicles. Already in the early hours of June 22nd, the 3rd Battalion of the 135th Regiment entered the Citadel through the Terespol Gate, and they immediately went to the Triple Arches Gate and the Kolm Gate to try to block the Soviets' escape. However, as I mentioned before, Commissar Yefim Fomin, who was leading the resistance at the Kolm Gate, he organized a very tenacious resistance, even with bayonet attacks. And he made the Germans retreat to the westernmost part of the Citadel. With the failure of the first day's attack, the Germans began to resort to tactics to exhaust the Soviets. For example, they controlled all water access, causing the Soviets inside the fortress to suffer from severe thirst. What happened was that, although the Bug River, which was quite large, was just a few meters away from the resistance post, the Germans kept all the exits under surveillance, and anyone who left to fetch water was immediately shot. So, thirst was the worst enemy of the resistance fighters. On the 24th, all the resistance groups inside the fortress gathered and decided to unify the defense under the command of Captain Ivan Nikolaevich Zubachev. On the 26th, the Germans stormed the Citadel's resistance headquarters and captured several leaders, including Commissar Fomin. Fomin was executed on the spot at the time of his capture due to the Commissar's order. The Commissar order was issued by Hitler to all invading forces. It ruled that all Red Army political commissars should be executed immediately upon capture, not treated as prisoners of war. After the 26th, only a few small pockets of resistance remained active inside the Citadel, and the Germans resorted to flamethrowers to drive the Soviet soldiers out of the sewers, trenches, and corners where they were holding out. Shortly after, the Citadel fell to the Germans. On the morning of June 30th, the fortress was considered captured by the 45th German Division, although some small and scattered pockets of resistance still continued in the underground tunnels until the end of July. Inscriptions were discovered after the war. For example, in 1952, one read, "I am dying, but I will not surrender. Farewell, my homeland, July 20th, 1941. Although much respect should be paid to the defenders of the Brest fortress, their resistance was, in the bigger picture, quite futile, because by the 28th, the Germans were already in Minsk, 350 kilometers east of the fortress, and by July 2nd, they were already in Smolensk, halfway to Moscow. Additionally, the Germans achieved key goals, such as securing the railroad and Bug River bridges, on day one. But such was the tenacity the Russians showed inside Brest that it personally impressed Hitler. And on August 8th, he, accompanied by Mussolini, visited the Brest fortress, already completely conquered under heavy security. The German win at Brest fortress was very costly. There were 429 soldiers killed, which represents 5% of all German soldiers killed on the entire Eastern Front in June of 1941. Soviet resistance hero Major Pyotr Gavrilov was captured by the Germans in July 1941 and stayed in captivity until the war ended in May 1945. He then returned to the Soviet Union and rejoined the Red Army. He was finally recognized and awarded the Golden Star of Hero of the Soviet Union in 1957. He died at 78 on January 26, 1979 in Krasnodar on the Black Sea. But rightly his body was transferred to Brest and buried there as a war hero. Well, once again, if you like this video, I hope you give it a like and subscribe to the channel as well, hitting the bell to receive notifications. As soon as I post more, I'll be signing off for now. Once again, thank you for watching and a big hug from SDG.